Hello everyone, it's History Behind the Warrior, and welcome back to yet another God of War video. Today, with us still coming off the hype of Ragnarok's release, I thought that we could touch on a very interesting faction in the Norse Saga, King Hrolf and his Legion of Berzerkers. Now, the Berserkers themselves are a bunch of interesting enemies in Ragnarok, being its equivalent to that of the Valkyries, but with them being optional bosses scattered throughout the 9 realms. Naturally, it did raise questions of who exactly was King Hrolf and what exactly are his Legion of Berzerkers, as throughout each and every encounter, Mimir spits upon both his name and the Berserkers themselves, barely elaborating on his disdain towards them. But why were they so shunned? Even by the likes of Mimir, no less, a man typically respectful to those of all shapes and sizes. Well, in today's video, I will be touching on King Hrolf, as well as his Berserker army, what made them become legend, and the differences between their game counterparts, and the source material they derive from. But before we do begin, as always everyone, I would super appreciate it if we could first get this video to 1,000 likes. It's a small thing, mind you, but trust me when I do say it goes a very long way, especially with YouTube curbing my channel's reach recently. And I mean, hey, if you like what we do here and wish to see more, please don't forget to subscribe and tick that bell. But without any further ado, let's get on with the video. Now, King Hrolf, better known as King Hrolf Kraki, is a figure based off a Danish Viking king, one whose tales originates from the 5th/6th century. Whilst not a well-known figure across the world, Hrolfs legend is rather well known throughout Scandinavia. With that said, who exactly was Hrolf? Well, if I'm entirely honest, Hrolf Kraki's story is one that is so vast and wide that it actually predates his own story. In fact, his rise to kingship is largely composed of other smaller stories that ultimately allowed his rise to flourish. Thus, the legend of Hrolf Kraki is typically referred to as a saga. Along with this, because it wasn't already complicated enough, there are in fact multiple different texts that depict this story. So in some iterations, there may be slight changes here, with names or particular details. Truth be told, there isn't a definitive story of Hrolf Kraki, but with that said, I will be talking about his more linear and commonly well-known narrative, being the Saga of Hrolf Kraki, as it's far more cohesive with how it tells his story. Now, the Saga of Hrolf Kraki encompasses a number of different and pretty crazy values in Viking culture, from long-running blood feuds between brothers, to wars with other kingdoms, and of course, because it's Norse mythology, a tiny hint of incest. Gross. So Hrolf comes from a long, illustrious bloodline of kings, with his grandfather being Halfding and his father being Helgi, whose wife was also his daughter. Don't think about it. Don't think about it. Despite his lineage having been filled with rather cruel figures, mind you, Hrolf was a rather charitable one, choosing to share his riches and glory, opposed to being one that held onto it. But his rise to power came from rather unusual circumstances. His sister mom, Yrsa, would be taken as bride by a ruthless Swedish king, King Aldis. Aldis is the villainous figure in this tale, leading a kingdom with his own berserkers. When Hrolf's father, Helgi, attempted to retrieve Yrsa, he would be invited to the kingdom under the false gaze of diplomacy. Once settled in, Helgi and his militia would be slaughtered by Aldis, so the title of king naturally fell into the hands of Hrolf. Now, retaliation was believed to be the first course of action, but instead, Hrolf would bide his time, allowing Aldous' own arrogance and degeneracy to crumble his court from within. And that it did, as former allies of Aldous would join Hrolf's army. With war inevitable, Hrolf went on the way to forge a weapon that embodied his will, one that could lead his army to victory, Skofnung. Hrolf then proceeded to recruit 12 Berserkers to serve by his side. So, with an army of 120, Hrolf's army marched towards Aldous' kingdom, with even Odin crossing their path in disguise to sway them. But the words of the Allfather were ignored, and the Vikings stormed Aldous' castle, spearheading their siege directly for his head. Trap after trap and trial after trial could simply not halt their assault. And eventually, after forcing Aldous on the run, they were able to kill the king, luring him out with golds and riches. So greed was ultimately the downfall of Aldous, and is what cemented Hrolf's legend. But how exactly does this translate over to the God of War universe? Well, honestly, not too well from a narratively accurate perspective, as it looks like the role between Aldous and Hrolf are completely flipped around, with Hrolf being seen as a villainous tyrant, and Aldous being described as a trustworthy and kind man. Now, from the minimal dialogue we do get from Mimir here, we are able to kind of paint a picture of what exactly happened during his time in Sweden. During Mimir's travel, where he was still on the run from the British Isles, it looks like he stumbled across King Aldous and his kingdom in Leda. After encountering the king, Mimir developed a form of kinship with Aldous, staying by his side in his beautiful kingdom. Now, knowing Mimir and his reputation, it would not at all surprise me if he had offered to become a sort of advisor to Aldous, much like he had done with Odin. But during this time, Hrolf had his crosshairs aimed at Aldous' head, seeking to take his throne for himself. You see, unlike the saga I had mentioned earlier, never at any point is Yrsa mentioned, or even Hrolf's royal heritage, meaning that his conquest may have been done from greed, as Mimir notes that Hrolf was never a king, only ever obtaining the title from killing Aldous. And whilst on the topic of Mimir, it is also worth pointing out that Mimir references actually trusting Hrolf at one point, something I believe would be one of his greatest mistakes, as it led to the downfall of both Leda as well as Aldous. Now, if we are reinterpreting these texts, I believe that much like Helgi's invitation to Aldous' table, a similar sort of event would have transpired. However, it wouldn't have been with Hrolf's Berserkers, but in fact Aldous'. You see, prior to Hrolf assembling his own 12 Berserkers in legend, Aldous had 12 of his own, and with Helgi never mentioned or presumably killed, as it led to Hrolf's 12 Berserkers, it's fairly safe to presume that Hrolf formed some sort of deal with Aldous' Berserkers, and during his meeting had Aldous killed, as Mimir describes each of their sword hilts as a symbol of their betrayal. So in summary, at least from how I'm fitting these pieces together, it looks like Mimir may have inadvertently played a hand in Aldous' demise, as he could have possibly been the one responsible for organizing peace between both sides, something that would have led to Aldous' betrayal. So, with Aldous dead, Hrolf could then rise to power, obtaining the title of king and becoming the new ruler of Leda. Thus, Mimir was forced to flee and presumably become an advisor to the Aesir. But Hrolf's reign did not last, as his empire would soon crumble and its legend would be lost to time, even to that of the gods. In death, it looks like his berserkers would scatter themselves across the 9 realms, holding fragments of Skolnung to keep it out of the hands of both gods and mortals. So, it looks like the saga of Hrolf Kraki was completely turned on its head with this reinterpretation of the tale. For so, it is not at all accurate with who Hrolf Kraki is. Now, the Berserker Legion themselves are quite an interesting bunch of characters. So here's a quick and brief summary of each of them. First, we have Hrolfs the Callous. This particular berserker was considered the torturer of the group, taking both time and pleasure in physically dismantling his prey opposed to killing it. So he would tactically chop off enemy limbs opposed to killing them instantly. Next, we have Kraki the Zealous. Of all of Hrolf's followers, this one was easily the most loyal and arrogant member of the group, but unfortunately, his details are few and far between. Thus, we do not know too much about him. Next, we have Hoklunga the Bearded. And, well, there's not too much to say about him, outside of him being distinguishedly different from the group with his large beard. Again, not much to really touch on outside of his physical appearance. He just thought the beard was neat. We now have Hrolfs the Bald, a berserker amongst the group that was unbelievably talented in necromancy, being able to raise the dead on a single flick of his hand. But it seemed in death he had only grown stronger. Being buried in the lands of Vanaheim, upon being summoned, it seemed like he had become one with Sidra magic, thus being able to control those tainted by said magic as puppets and minions. We now move on to Begaida the Feared. Now, in the game, not much is mentioned of Begaida as an individual, but seeing as Hrolf's Berserkers are literal twists on already established tales, we know from the saga that this was an individual that encouraged Hrolf's charitable nature, spreading gold and wealth throughout the land. But with this myth twisted, it wouldn't be hard to believe for robbing and killing the inhabitants of Leda under Hrolf's command. Moving on to our next berserker, we have Skolnthi, the Unerring. Now, unlike her fellow berserkers, who had grown infamous through direct contact, she had earned her stripes from being an assassin. She was one that took pride in her work, not stopping at killing her target, but every ally and every loved one tied to them. We now have Hrolfs the Stolid. She, by all intents and purposes, could be described as a sadist. Even amongst the berserkers, she had a taste for bludgeoning her victims to death, not stopping until their body was in literal bits. She took immense pride in the annihilation of both flesh and bone. We next have Votra the Prideful. This one was one of Hrolf's personal favorites. Originating as a performer of the arts, she was as deceitful as she was cunning, especially with her talent for destructive magic. Next is Hrolmunda the Cruel. This one was a particular sort of evil, as one time during Hrold's crusades, when a group of generals surrendered before them, instead of giving them mercy, she would have blood eagles performed on each and every remaining one alive, truly living up to her name and mantle. Moving on, we have Sveipdaga the Cold. Now, quite little is known about this particular berserker, as even in her own tales and poems, Sveikdasmal, in this story, she's in a completely different light, and is actually a male, someone pursuing a bride in the goddess Menglo. Now, the Cold in Sveipdaga's title could in fact be reference to how he attempted to infiltrate her kingdom in disguise as a frost giant, identifying as Vindkunda, which translates to wind cold. we now have Bodvar the Fierce. And once again, the details of this Berserker are very vague, only being described in-game as all the brains of a hammer. But in his own tales, Bodvar is of royal blood, being a rightful heir to leading Norway, at least until his family was tainted by a curse. What's also interesting is that he's considered to be a shapeshifter, in a way emulating Atreus' powers to morph into a bear. However, this doesn't at all seem to influence his game's counterpart, so he does not seem to be as heavily influenced from his tale and origin. And our final and last Berserker here is Hrolf the Troublesome. She was also an assassin amongst the Berserkers, choosing to strike during the darkness of night. However, she was exceptionally cruel in how she carried out these executions, killing entire families to fan the flames of war or snuff them out before they could begin. Truly a heartless one amongst the Berserkers. With that said, everyone, I hope you have enjoyed this one and learnt more from it. This was a lot to cover, but I do hope that by watching this, you've been able to walk away knowing more about King Hrolf and his Berserker Legion. I must say, I do really like this twist on this otherwise very charitable figure in Norse myth. On paper, it seems like a pretty crazy and out there idea, but it's one that bends the rules of what we know and come to expect. Especially when it comes to the God of War series, where even the most charitable figures can be twisted into deformed monsters. And I must say, I do actually like the game's version of Hrolf much more than his own Saga. Plus, you know, less incest, so that's a thumbs up from me. Anyway guys, what do you think of the Berserkers in God of War? Do you like their inclusion? Are they a worthy successor to the Valkyries? Will this three-way fight ever not be unbelievably fucking annoying? Please do comments down below. But anyway guys, that has been it for me. So as always everyone, stay strong, stay well, and keep on fighting, as Ragnarok's finally here. Take care everyone, I'll see you soon.